The old house at the end of Maple Street had seen better days, just like Rose Martinez, who lived there. At 72, Rose spent most of her time in her favorite armchair by the window, watching the neighborhood children play. Her hands, once strong enough to knead bread for the whole block, now shook as she tried to hold her morning coffee. Tommy Martinez watched his grandmother from the kitchen doorway, his heart breaking a little more each day. At 13, he understood more than any child his age should about medical bills and payment plans. The stack of unopened envelopes on the kitchen counter grew taller every week, each one stamped with red, urgent notices from Memorial Hospital. "Abuela, I made you some toast," Tommy said, carrying the plate to her. The smell of cinnamon, just the way she liked it, filled the room. Rose smiled at her grandson, but Tommy could see the pain behind her eyes. The heart condition was getting worse, and they both knew it. "My sweet boy," Rose said, touching his cheek, "you take better care of me than I ever did of you." Her voice was barely above a whisper these days, so different from the strong, vibrant woman who had raised him after his parents died in that terrible car accident 8 years ago. Tommy sat on the floor next to her chair, just like he used to do when he was smaller. "Mrs. Peterson from next door brought over some soup. She says hi." He didn't mention that Mrs. Peterson had also brought over a church donation envelope, or that he'd seen her crying on the porch after visiting with Rose. The TV news droned on in the background, talking about rising medical costs and insurance problems. Tommy tried not to listen. Instead, he focused on the music coming from the Lopez family's house across the street. They always had parties on Saturday afternoons with everyone singing and laughing. "Remember how you used to sing at those parties, Abuela?" Tommy asked, trying to cheer her up. "You had the most beautiful voice in the neighborhood." Rose's eyes lit up for a moment. "Music was my life before all this," she said, gesturing vaguely at her chest where the pain lived now. "Your mother got her voice from me, you know. And you, mi amor, you got it from her." Tommy thought about the choir teacher at school who was always begging him to join. He'd always said no, too shy to sing in front of others, but now, watching his grandmother struggle to even hold her toast, an idea began to form in his mind. Later that night, after Rose had gone to bed, Tommy sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and all those unopened bills. The numbers made his head spin. The surgery Rose needed would cost more money than he could even imagine. Their small savings were gone, spent on medications and doctor visits. The insurance only covered so much, and the rest seemed impossible. He opened his laptop, the one he'd gotten as a hand-me-down from his cousin Miguel, and started searching. "Ways to raise money for medical bills," he typed. The usual suggestions popped up: GoFundMe, charity events, bank loans. But then he saw something else. "Local restaurant seeks weekend entertainment." The advertisement was for Lorenzo's, the fancy Italian place downtown where rich people went on dates. They were looking for musicians to perform during dinner hours. The pay wasn't much, but tips could be good, especially if the customers were feeling generous. Tommy's hands shook as he picked up his phone and dialed the number. A gruff voice answered, "Lorenzo's restaurant." "Hi," Tommy said, his voice cracking. "I'm calling about the entertainment position." He almost hung up right then, but he thought about Rose's medical bills, about her getting weaker every day, about the doctor saying she needed surgery soon. "So you sing?" the voice asked. "Yes, sir, I do. Come by tomorrow at 2 p.m. Ask for Mr. Lorenzo. You get one song to prove yourself, kid." After hanging up, Tommy sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to his grandmother's labored breathing. From the next room. He hadn't performed in front of anyone since the second-grade talent show, and that had been a disaster. But now everything depended on his voice. He pulled up YouTube and started practicing, keeping his voice low so he wouldn't wake Rose. The song he chose was one his grandmother used to sing to him when he was little, the one about dreams and stars and never giving up. If he was going to do this, he would do it with her song. As he practiced into the night, Tommy didn't know that his small act of courage would soon change not just his life and Rose's, but the lives of everyone who would hear him sing. Sometimes the biggest miracles start with the smallest steps, and in Tommy's case, it would start with a single song in a crowded restaurant. Sunday afternoon came too quickly. Tommy stood outside Lorenzo's restaurant, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. The place was fancier than anything he'd ever seen, with giant windows and golden door handles that probably cost more than his grandmother's monthly medication. "You just gonna stand there all day, kid?" Tommy jumped at the voice behind him. A tall man in an expensive suit was watching him, keys jingling in his hand. The man's face was stern, but his eyes were kind. "I'm here for the audition," Tommy stammered. "Mr. Lorenzo." "That's me." The restaurant owner unlocked the door. "Come on in. Let's see what you've got." Inside, the restaurant was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the tables were set with white tablecloths and shiny silverware. Tommy felt very small in his best clothes, which were really just clean jeans and the button-up shirt he wore for school pictures. "Stand over there." Mr. Lorenzo pointed to a small stage area near the bar. "What are you going to sing?" Tommy wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. "Stars in the Night. It's an old Spanish song my grandmother taught me." Mr. Lorenzo raised an eyebrow. "English version, I hope. My customers aren't big on foreign languages." "Yes, sir, I know both versions." A few workers were setting up for the evening, arranging flowers and polishing glasses. They all stopped to watch, making Tommy's stomach twist into knots. He closed his eyes and thought about Rose, about how she needed this money, about all. The time she'd sung this very song to him, the first note came out shaky. Tommy wanted to stop, to run away, but then he remembered the unopened bills on the kitchen counter. He took a deep breath and started again. "When the night is dark and the stars are bright, every dream takes flight on silver wings." His voice grew stronger with each word. The song filled the empty restaurant, bouncing off the fancy walls and crystal glasses. Tommy kept his eyes closed, imagining he was just singing for his grandmother in their living room. When he finished, there was silence. He opened his eyes, terrified of what he might see. The workers had stopped completely, staring at him. Mr. Lorenzo's stern face had softened. "How old are you, kid?" Mr. Lorenzo asked. 13, sir." "And where did you learn to sing like that?" "My grandmother taught me. She used to be a singer, too, before—" Tommy's voice cracked. "Before she got sick." Mr. Lorenzo walked over to the bar and poured himself a glass of water. The silence stretched on forever. Finally, he turned back to Tommy. "Here's the deal. We do dinner service Tuesday through Sunday, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. I can give you Friday and Saturday nights, 2 sets each night. Pay is $50 per night, plus whatever tips you make. You'll need at least 10 songs to start." Tommy's heart soared. "Really? I mean, yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. You start this Friday. If the customers don't like you, that's it. And kid?" Mr. Lorenzo's face turned serious again. "You'll need better clothes. This is a high-class establishment." Tommy's excitement dimmed. A little. He didn't own any fancy clothes and they couldn't afford to buy any. But before he could worry about it, one of the waitresses stepped forward. She was an older lady with grey hair and kind eyes that reminded him of Rose. "I have a grandson about your size," she said. "He outgrew his good clothes months ago. They're just sitting in my closet. Would you like them?" I couldn't," Tommy started to say, but the waitress was already writing down her address. "I'm Maria. Come by tomorrow after school. We'll get you fixed up proper." She smiled warmly. "That voice of yours deserves the right stage clothes." Walking home, Tommy felt like he was floating. $50 a night plus tips, and 2 nights every week. He started adding up the numbers in his head. It wasn't enough for the surgery, not even close, but it was a start. He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost ran into Mrs. Peterson on their front walk. She was bringing another pot of soup for Rose. "Tommy, where have you been? Your grandmother was worried sick." Tommy's stomach dropped. In his excitement about the audition, he'd forgotten to tell Rose where he was going. He rushed inside to find her in her chair, more pale than usual. "Abuela, I'm so sorry. I just went for a walk. I didn't mean to worry you." Rose reached for his hand. "It's okay, mi amor. I just get scared sometimes after what happened to your parents." She didn't finish the sentence. She never did. Tommy sat next to her chair and held her hand. He wanted to tell her about the restaurant, about his big chance to help her, but he knew she would say no, would tell him to focus on school instead. So he kept quiet, and just listened as she told him about the telenovela she'd been watching. That night, after Rose was asleep, Tommy pulled out his phone and started making a list of songs. They had to be perfect. Everything depended on it. As he worked, he could hear Rose coughing in her room, and each cough made him more determined. "I'm going to fix this, Abuela," he whispered into the darkness. "Just hold on a little longer." He didn't know it yet, but across town, Mr. Lorenzo was making some calls of his own. The restaurant owner hadn't told Tommy, but several of his regular customers were important people in the music industry. Friday night was about to become much more than just a dinner service at Lorenzo's. The week flew by in a blur of preparations. Maria, the kind waitress from Lorenzo's, had been true to her word. Her grandson's clothes fit Tommy perfectly. 3 nice dress shirts, 2 pairs of black slacks, and even a tie that matched his eyes. She'd refused to take any money, saying only, "You can pay me back by making those fancy customers cry with that beautiful voice of yours." Tommy practiced every moment he could, singing quietly in his room after Rose went to bed, humming under his breath while doing homework. He'd chosen 10 songs that reminded him of his grandmother, old classics that told stories of love, hope, and never giving up. Each night he checked on Rose while she slept, watching her chest rise and fall with difficult breaths. The doctor's words echoed in his mind. The surgery can't wait much longer. Friday evening arrived with a mix of excitement and terror. Tommy told Rose he was going to study at his friend Miguel's house. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but he knew she would only worry if she knew the truth. He kissed her goodbye, promised to be back by 10, and tried not to see how tired she looked. "Call me if you need anything, Abuela. Mrs. Peterson is right next door." Go, Rose smiled weakly. "Have fun with your friends. I'll be fine with my novellas." The walk to Lorenzo's seemed both too long and too short. Tommy's new clothes felt stiff and strange, but when he caught his reflection in the restaurant's windows, he barely recognized himself. He looked older, more serious, like someone who could actually help his grandmother. Inside, the restaurant was already half full. Rich people in expensive clothes sat at candlelit tables, talking quietly over plates of pasta that cost more than Tommy's weekly grocery budget. Maria spotted him and hurried over. "There's my star." She straightened his tie with motherly hands. "Mr. Lorenzo wants you to start in 15 minutes. Are you ready?" Tommy nodded, not trusting his voice. Maria squeezed his shoulder and pointed him toward the small stage area, now set up with a microphone and a simple spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Lorenzo's voice filled the restaurant. "Tonight we have a special treat for you. Please welcome our new Friday night entertainment, young Tommy Martinez." The polite applause felt like thunder in Tommy's ears. His hands shook as he stepped up to the microphone. The spotlight was hot and bright, making it hard to see the audience. Maybe that was better. He closed his eyes and thought of Rose, of all the times she'd sung to him when he was scared or sad. Her voice had always made everything better. Now it was his turn to use that same gift to help her. The first note came out clear and strong. Tommy had chosen to start with "Stars in the Night," the song that had won him the audition. As he sang, something magical happened. The restaurant grew quiet. Forks stopped clinking against plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. By the second verse, Tommy dared to open his eyes. In the dim light beyond the spotlight, he could see people watching him, really watching him. An older woman at a nearby table was wiping her eyes with her napkin. A man in an expensive suit had stopped his phone conversation to listen. When the song ended, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the applause started. Not polite this time, but real and enthusiastic. Tommy saw Mr. Lorenzo nodding approvingly from his spot near the bar. As he moved into his second song, Tommy noticed a man sitting alone at a corner table, watching him intently. The man wore a sharp suit and kept writing something in a small notebook. Tommy tried not to look at him, focusing instead on the music, on thoughts of Rose, on the reason he was here. By the end of his first set, Tommy's tip jar was half full. Of bills, Maria beamed at him from behind the bar, giving him a thumbs up. During his break, she brought him a glass of water and a plate of spaghetti. "On the house," she whispered. "You need to keep your strength up. And Tommy, There's a man here from Capitol Records. Mr. Lorenzo called him specially. Tommy almost choked on his water. What? Why didn't you tell me before? Because you would have been too nervous. Now eat your dinner. You have another set to do. The second set went even better than the first. Tommy felt more confident, letting his voice soar through the restaurant. He sang about dreams and love, about hope and second chances. With each song, more people stopped eating to listen. The tip jar filled up even more. When it was all over, Mr. Lorenzo called him to his office. Tommy's heart pounded as he followed the restaurant owner down a narrow hallway. The man from the corner table was waiting there, his notebook open on his knee. "That was quite a performance, young man," he said, standing up. "I'm David Cooper from Capitol Records. Would you mind telling me where you learned to sing like that?" Tommy's mouth went dry. "My grandmother taught me. She was a singer too before. She got sick." Mr. Cooper nodded, writing something down. "And how would you feel about making a demo recording? Just a few songs to see what we might be able to do with that voice of yours." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Tommy grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. A recording? We'd need to talk to your guardian, of course. But yes, I think there might be some real potential here." Tommy thought of Rose, of her medical bills, of the surgery she needed. Could this be the answer to their prayers? But then he remembered. He hadn't told her anything about singing at the restaurant. How could he explain this? Mr. Lorenzo cleared his throat. "The boys got another set tomorrow night, David. Why don't you bring some of your people by? Let them hear him too." As Tommy walked home that night, his pockets heavy with tips and his head spinning with possibilities, he realized he had a big decision to make. He could keep this secret from Rose, keep trying to save her on his own. Or he could tell her everything and risk her making him stop. The house was dark when he got home, except for the blue flicker of the TV in the living room. Rose had fallen asleep in her chair again. Tommy covered her with a blanket and kissed her forehead. "I'm going to save you, Abuela," he whispered. "Whatever it takes." He didn't notice that Rose's eyes had opened slightly, that she had heard every word, and he certainly didn't see the tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched her grandson count out his tips at the kitchen table, singing softly to himself in the darkness. Saturday morning came too early. Tommy found Rose already awake in her chair, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes. Something was different about her expression, and his heart skipped a beat. "Sit down, mi amor," she said softly. "We need to talk." Tommy's stomach twisted into a knot. He knew that tone. It was the same one she'd used when she told him about his parents' accident. "I heard you last night," Rose continued, her voice trembling. "I heard what you said about saving me, and I heard you singing." Tommy collapsed onto the couch, his secret crumbling around him. "Abuela, I can explain." "Mrs. Peterson told me everything," Rose cut him off gently. "About you singing at Lorenzo's. About the tips. About the man from the record company." She reached for his hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears filled Tommy's eyes. "Because I knew you'd try to stop me. The surgery cost so much money, and I had to do something. I couldn't just watch you get sicker and sicker." Rose pulled him close, and Tommy could feel her shoulders shaking. "Oh, my brave, foolish boy, you're just like your mother. She would have done the same thing." "Are you mad at me?" "Mad?" Rose wiped her eyes. "I'm proud of you, but Tommy, this is too much responsibility for a 13-year-old boy. The surgery, it might not even work." "Don't say that." Tommy pulled away. "It has to work, and now we have a chance. Mr. Cooper from Capitol Records wants me to make a demo. If it goes well..." A coughing fit interrupted Rose's response. Tommy rushed to get her water and medicine, his hands shaking as he counted out the pills. When she could breathe again, she looked even more tired than usual. "Promise me something," she said, gripping his hand. "Promise me you won't give up your childhood for me. Music should bring you joy, not burden." Before Tommy could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was Maria from the restaurant, carrying a large paper bag. "Hope I'm not interrupting," she said, looking between Tommy and Rose. "Mr. Lorenzo sent me with breakfast for you both. And Tommy, he wants to know if you can come in early today. The record company people are bringing a photographer." Rose's eyes widened. "Please come in, tell me everything about my grandson singing." As Maria settled into their worn armchair, sharing stories about Tommy's performance and the customers' reactions, something changed in Rose's face. The worry lines softened, replaced by a familiar spark, the same one she used to get when she talked about her own singing days. "You know," Rose said thoughtfully, "I still have my old performance dresses in the attic. The black one with the silver trim might be perfect for tonight if we take it in a bit." Tommy stared at her. "You mean you're letting me continue?" "On one condition." Rose's face turned serious. "I come to watch tonight. Mrs. Peterson already offered to drive me." "But Abuela, your health—" "My health is exactly why I need to do this. I want to see my grandson shine while I still can." The room grew quiet. Maria squeezed Rose's hand, understanding. Passing between the two women, Tommy felt tears threatening again but held them back. "Okay," he said finally, "but you have to promise to tell me if you get too tired." The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Mrs. Peterson and Maria helped Rose dress and do her hair. Tommy's Aunt Carmen came over when she heard the news, bringing her sewing kit to alter Rose's old dress. The small house filled with more energy than it had seen in months. By late afternoon, Tommy was dressed in his best clothes, hair neatly combed. Rose sat in her chair wearing her old black dress that now fit perfectly, a touch of red lipstick brightening her pale face. Mrs. Peterson's car waited outside. "Ready?" Rose asked, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Tommy took her hand. "Ready." What they didn't know was that across town, Mr. Cooper was making calls that would change everything. The video someone had taken of Tommy's performance the night before had already gone viral on social media. Local news stations were asking for interviews. But most importantly, a famous singer who had seen the video was cancelling his evening plans to come hear Tommy sing. The little family's story of love, sacrifice, and music was about to reach far beyond the walls of Lorenzo's restaurant. And, somewhere in heaven, Tommy's parents were surely smiling down on their son, who had inherited not just his mother's voice, but also her incredible heart. As Mrs. Peterson's car pulled away from the curb, the neighbors came out to wave. Word had spread quickly in their tight-knit community. Tommy Martinez, the quiet boy who never made trouble, was about to become their very own star. Rose watched her grandson's nervous excitement with tears in her eyes. She hadn't told him about the pain that had gotten worse that morning, or about the doctor's urgent voicemail. Tonight wasn't about her illness. Tonight was about watching her grandson's dreams take flight, just like in the song she had taught him so long. "Hello, your parents would be so proud," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Tommy smiled, but his heart was racing. In a few hours, he would sing for the biggest audience of his life. And this time, his grandmother would be there to see it. He silently prayed for the strength to make this night perfect. For her, for his parents' memory, and for all the dreams that hung in the balance. Lorenzo's restaurant was more crowded than Tommy had ever seen it. Word had spread about the young singer with the amazing voice, and people were actually waiting outside hoping to get a table. Mr. Lorenzo had put Rose at the best spot in the house, right near the small stage where she could see everything. "Your grandmother is beautiful," Maria whispered to Tommy as they watched Rose chatting with the other waitresses. In her black dress and with her silver hair styled elegantly, she looked more like her old self than she had in months. She was quite the singer in her day, you know. The older staff still remember her performing here 30 years ago. Tommy's head snapped up. "What? Abuela performed here?" Maria nodded. "Every Friday night, just like you. That's why Mr. Lorenzo gave you the chance so quickly." He never forgot her voice. Before Tommy could ask more questions, Mr. Lorenzo appeared with the man from Capitol Records. Mr. Cooper wasn't alone this time. He had brought 3 other people in expensive suits, all carrying phones and tablets. "Tommy, these are some very important people who want to hear you sing," Mr. Cooper said. "And," he paused for effect, "James Morrison is on his way." Tommy's knees went weak. James Morrison was only the biggest pop star in the country. His latest album had sold millions of copies, and his concerts sold out in minutes. "He saw your video online," Mr. Cooper explained, "cancelled his dinner plans to come hear you in person." The restaurant was buzzing with excitement. Someone had leaked the news about James Morrison's visit, and now there were even more people trying to get in. Photographers had shown up outside, their camera flashes visible through the windows. Rose noticed Tommy's pale face and motioned him over to her table. "Come here, mi amor," she said, taking his trembling hands in hers. "Let me tell you a secret. When I was young and singing here, I was terrified every single night, but then I would look at the people's faces, see how the music touched their hearts, and the fear would disappear. But Abuela, James Morrison is coming, he's famous. What if I mess up?" Rose squeezed his hands. "Sing for me, just like you always do. Forget everyone else. The rest will take care of itself." Mr. Lorenzo's voice cut through the crowd noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our very own Tommy Martinez." The applause was thunderous. Tommy walked to the microphone, his legs feeling like jelly. He looked at Rose, saw her encouraging smile, and took a deep breath. The first song was "Stars," "In the Night," but this time he sang it in Spanish, the way Rose had first taught it to him. He watched his grandmother's eyes fill with tears as the familiar melody filled the room. The audience might not understand the words, but they could feel the emotion in every note. Halfway through his second song, a stir went through the crowd. James Morrison had arrived, slipping quietly into a corner table. Tommy's voice wavered for a moment, but then he caught Rose's eye again. She nodded slightly, and he found his strength. As he started his third song, Tommy noticed Rose pressing, her hand to her chest, her face growing pale. Mrs. Peterson leaned over to whisper something to her, but Rose shook her head firmly. She wasn't going to leave no matter what. Tommy sang his heart out, each song telling the story of their love, their struggles, their hopes. The audience was completely silent between songs, hanging on every note. Even the waiters had stopped, serving to listen. When he finished his last song, the silence lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then the applause exploded. People were standing, cheering, wiping tears from their eyes. James Morrison was the first one on his feet, but Tommy wasn't looking at any of them. His eyes were fixed on Rose, who was slumped in her chair. Mrs. Peterson, holding her up. "Abuela!" He jumped off the stage, pushing through the crowd to reach her. "I'm okay," Rose whispered, but her face was gray. "Just tired. So proud of you, mi amor." Her eyes closed and her head fell forward. The restaurant erupted in chaos. Someone was calling 911. Mr. Lorenzo was clearing a path to the door. James Morrison himself helped carry Rose's chair outside to "Wait for the ambulance to stay with me, Abuela," Tommy begged, holding her hand. "Please stay with me." The ambulance arrived with wailing sirens, its red lights painting the crowd's faces in an eerie glow. As the paramedics worked, Tommy felt a hand on his shoulder. It was James Morrison. "Go with her," the star said. "But first, take this." He pressed a business card into Tommy's hand. "My private number, call me tomorrow, that voice of yours when we need to talk." Tommy barely heard him. He climbed into the ambulance beside Rose, still in his performance clothes, still clutching her hand. The paramedics worked quickly, attaching monitors and starting an IV. "Blood pressure's dropping," one of them said urgently. "We need to move." As the ambulance sped through the streets, its sirens clearing the way, Tommy sang softly to his grandmother. The same lullaby she had sung to him countless times, now offered back with all the love in his young heart. Behind the ambulance, a line of cars followed. Mr. Lorenzo and Maria, Mrs. Peterson, the record company people, even James Morrison. All of them drawn into the orbit of a boy's love for his grandmother and the music that expressed it. None of them knew that this night would become legendary in the neighborhood, the night when tragedy and triumph danced so closely together. The night when a young boy's voice touched hearts far beyond the walls of a simple Italian restaurant. The night when love and music worked their own kind of miracle. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. Tommy sat in the waiting room, still wearing his performance clothes, while doctors worked to stabilize Rose. Mrs. Peterson sat beside him, holding his hand, while Maria from the restaurant paced back and forth, making phone calls to everyone they knew. Family of Rose Martinez. Tommy jumped up as a doctor approached. Her face was serious and Tommy's heart sank. "Your grandmother's condition is critical," the doctor explained gently. "Her heart is very weak. She needs the surgery immediately. But..." She glanced at Mrs. Peterson. I understand there are some financial issues." Before Tommy could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Money won't be a problem." James Morrison stepped forward. He had been so quiet in the corner of the waiting room that Tommy had almost forgotten he was there. The famous singer pulled out his phone and handed it to the doctor. "That's my manager's number. He'll handle all the arrangements. Just do whatever Mrs. Martinez needs." Tommy stared at him in disbelief. "But why?" James knelt down to meet Tommy's eyes. "Because 30 years ago, when I was just starting out, a beautiful singer named Rose Martinez let me perform at her shows here in town. She believed in me when nobody else did. I never forgot that kindness," Mrs. Peterson gasped. "That's right, I remember now. You were that skinny kid with the guitar who used to hang around Lorenzo's." The doctor was already on the phone with James's manager. Tommy could hear words like private room and best surgical team, but they felt distant and unreal. His mind was spinning with this new information about his grandmother's past. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" he whispered. "Your grandmother was never one to brag," Mrs. Peterson said softly. "After your parents' accident, she gave up everything to raise you, but music was always in her heart." The waiting room began to fill up as word spread. Mr. Lorenzo arrived with containers of food for everyone. Tommy's teachers from school showed up. Even his principal came, carrying a card signed by all his classmates. Local news reporters gathered outside the hospital, trying to get the story of the young singer and the famous star. But inside, in the quiet of the waiting room, Tommy sat with his head bowed, praying and humming softly. Hours passed. The surgery was complicated, the doctor had warned them. Every time the operating room doors swung open, Tommy's heart would jump. But it was never news about Rose. Mr. Cooper from Capitol Records arrived around midnight with surprising news. "Tommy, that video of you singing tonight, it's gone viral. Over 1 million views already. People are calling from all over the country, wanting to know your story." But Tommy barely heard him. What good was fame if he lost his grandmother? He pressed his face into Mrs. Peterson's shoulder and finally let himself cry. Dawn was breaking when the surgeon finally appeared, looking tired but smiling. "The surgery was successful," she announced. "Mrs. Martinez is stable. Her new heart valve is working well." The waiting room erupted in tears and hugs. James Morrison shook hands with the doctor, while Mr. Lorenzo crossed himself and muttered prayers of thanks. But Tommy could only ask one question: "Can I see her?" The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Rose looked small and pale in the hospital bed, but her breathing was stronger than it had been in months. Tommy sat beside her, holding her hand, watching her chest rise and fall. "You should get some rest," Maria said, bringing him a blanket. "We'll wake you if anything changes." But Tommy shook his head. "I want to be here when she wakes up. I need to tell her." "Tell me what, mi amor?" Tommy's head snapped up. Rose's eyes were open, focusing slowly on his face. "Abuela." He leaned forward, careful not to disturb any of the tubes and wires. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Rose whispered, managing a weak smile. "But I heard you singing. In my dreams, I heard you." "I didn't stop," Tommy said, tears rolling down his cheeks. "Not for a minute. The doctors said it helped keep your heart steady during the surgery." Rose squeezed his hand feebly. "My boy, my beautiful, talented boy." Her eyes moved past him to where James Morrison stood in the doorway. "Jimmy? Is that really you?" "Hello, Rose," James said softly, coming into the room. "You look just as beautiful as when you used to let me steal your spotlight at Lorenzo's." Tommy watched in amazement as his grandmother and the famous singer reminisced about old times, about songs they used to perform together, about dreams that had taken different paths. "Your grandson has your gift," James told her. "And when you're stronger, I want to talk to you both about some ideas I have." Rose's eyes were getting heavy, the medication making her drowsy. "Tommy," she murmured, "sing for me? Our song?" And there, in the early morning light of the hospital room, Tommy sang "Stars in the Night" one more time. His voice was rough from exhaustion and tears, But it didn't matter. As he sang, nurses stopped in the hallway to listen. James Morrison harmonized softly from the corner, and Rose drifted off to sleep with a peaceful smile on her face. Outside, the hospital, the sun was rising on a new day. Reporters were still camped out, waiting for news. Social media was buzzing with Tommy's video and the story of James Morrison's intervention. But inside room 507, none of that mattered. A grandmother and grandson held hands, their hearts beating in sync, while the music that had always bound them together worked its quiet magic. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. Rose got stronger every day, her color returning, her breathing easier with the new heart valve. The hospital room looked more like a flower shop, with bouquets arriving constantly from well-wishers. Cards and letters poured in from all over the country, many from people who had seen Tommy's viral video. "Listen to this one," Tommy said, sitting by Rose's bed and opening another envelope. "Dear Tommy and Mrs. Martinez, your story touched my heart. I lost my own grandmother last year, and watching you sing to yours reminded me of all our precious moments together." Rose smiled, adjusting her position in the hospital bed. "People are so kind." "But you haven't told me what James Morrison said. In your meeting yesterday?" Tommy's face lit up. He had tried to keep the news to himself, not wanting to overwhelm his grandmother while she recovered, but he couldn't hold it in any longer. "He wants to produce my first album," Tommy burst out, "and he says you have to be part of it. He wants us to record Stars in the Night together, once you're strong enough." "Me?" Rose's hand flew to her chest, an old habit she hadn't lost even after the surgery. "But I haven't sung professionally in years." "That's not what Mr. Lorenzo says." Tommy grinned. "He told me you used to be the best singer in town. Why didn't you ever tell me about helping James Morrison when he was starting out?" Rose's eyes grew distant with memory. "Those were different times, mi amor. Jimmy, that's what we called him then, was just a skinny boy with big dreams. He would come to Lorenzo's every night begging to sing just one song. How could I say no? He reminded me of myself when I was young." The door opened and Maria came in with a fresh coffee for Tommy. She had taken time off from the restaurant to help care for Rose, saying that family was more important than any job. "The news crews are still outside," she reported, "and you'll never guess who's on the cover of Entertainment Weekly." She held up the magazine. There it was, a photo of Tommy singing at Lorenzo's, with Rose watching from her table. The headline read, "A Song of Love, the viral sensation that captured America's heart." "Oh my," Rose whispered, touching the magazine with trembling fingers. "You look so handsome, mi amor, just like your father." Tommy swallowed hard. He wished his parents could see all this, could know how their love of music lived on through him. As if reading his thoughts, Rose reached for his hand. "They're watching," she said softly. "They're so proud of you." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. It was Mr. Cooper from Capitol Records, carrying a thick folder and looking excited. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I have some papers for you both to look at. James Morrison's lawyer has reviewed everything. It's a very generous contract, especially for a first album." Tommy and Rose looked at each other. This was it, the moment that could change their lives forever. But before they could say anything, another visitor arrived. Mr. Lorenzo walked in carrying his familiar leather briefcase. "Before anyone signs anything," he said firmly, "I have something to show you." He pulled out an old newspaper, yellowed with age. The headline jumped out, "Local singer Rose Martinez signs with major label." The photo showed a young Rose, beautiful and confident, holding a contract. "You were signed too?" Tommy asked, stunned. Rose's face fell. "For a very short time. But then, your parents had their accident, and you needed me. Some dreams have to wait for the right moment." Mr. Lorenzo sat down heavily in the visitor's chair. "I kept every article about you, Rose. You were supposed to be a star, and now, through your grandson, maybe that dream can live again." Mr. Cooper cleared his throat. "That's exactly what we're proposing. A duet album, grandmother and grandson. James Morrison will produce. We'll tell your story through music." The room fell silent. Tommy looked at Rose, seeing not just his grandmother, but the young singer she had once been. The woman who had given up her dreams to raise him, who had poured all her love and music into his heart. "What do you think, Abuela?" he asked softly. Rose was quiet for a long moment, looking at the old newspaper, then at the new magazine, then at her grandson's hopeful face. "I think," she said finally, her voice growing stronger, "that God works in mysterious ways. Maybe this isn't just your second chance, mi amor. Maybe it's mine too." Maria was crying openly now. Mr. Lorenzo pulled out a handkerchief to dab at his eyes. Even Mr. Cooper looked emotional. "Then it's settled," Mr. Cooper said, opening his folder. "Shall we begin?" As they went through the contract, more visitors arrived. Mrs. Peterson brought fresh cookies. Tommy's teachers came with his homework and news that the school was planning a special assembly in his honor. James Morrison called to check on Rose and discuss song selections. Through it all, Tommy held his grandmother's hand, marveling at how much had changed in just a few days. From singing in secret at Lorenzo's to try to save Rose, to potentially recording an album with her, it felt like a dream. But when Rose started humming their special song and Tommy joined in without missing a beat, he knew it was real. Their voices blended perfectly, filling the hospital room with hope and love and second chances. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Camera crews packed up their equipment, already planning their evening news stories about the grandmother and grandson who had captured the nation's heart. But inside room 507, Tommy and Rose simply sang together, their hearts beating strong and steady, their dreams finally coming true. 3 weeks after the surgery, Rose was strong enough to leave the hospital. The doctors called her recovery miraculous, but Tommy knew it was more than that. It was love. Music and second chances all working together. Their small house had been transformed while Rose was in the hospital. The community had come together, led by Mr. Lorenzo and Mrs. Peterson, to fix everything. The walls had fresh paint, the garden was blooming with new flowers, and the living room had a brand new comfortable chair for Rose. "We can't accept all this," Rose protested weakly when she saw the changes. "Yes, we can," Tommy said firmly, helping her into the new chair. "These people are our family too." The biggest surprise was in Tommy's room. James Morrison had sent over professional recording equipment, microphones, headphones, and a computer with music software. They would start recording demo tracks at home while Rose continued to recover. "Technology is amazing these days," James explained during one of his frequent video calls. "We can get great quality recordings right there in your bedroom. Then when Rose is stronger, we'll do the final versions in the studio." Every day brought new adventures. Reporters called constantly wanting interviews. Talk shows requested appearances. The local news did a special feature about the singing Martinez family that had the whole neighborhood gathering to watch. "Look at this letter," Maria said one morning, sorting through their fan mail. She had officially become their assistant, helping manage all the attention. "It's from a grandmother in Texas who started singing with her own grandson after seeing your video. You're inspiring people." Tommy was trying to stay focused on school despite all the excitement. His teachers were understanding, letting him do some work from home so he could be near Rose. His classmates treated him like a celebrity, but his true friends, like Miguel, kept him grounded. "Don't forget us little people when you're famous," Miguel joked during lunch. "Never," Tommy promised. "You're stuck with me." The recording sessions at home became the highlight of each day. Rose would sit in Tommy's room, getting stronger all the time, teaching him the harmonies she had learned in her own singing days. James Morrison would join by video chat, offering advice and encouragement. "The way your voices blend is magical," James said during one session. "It's like hearing the past and future come together." They started with "Stars in the Night," recording both English and Spanish versions. Rose's voice was rusty at first, but with each take it grew stronger and more confident. Tommy loved watching her come alive again, seeing the young singer she had once been shine through. "Remember when you used to sing this to me after bad dreams?" Tommy asked during a break. Rose smiled, adjusting her oxygen tube. She still needed it sometimes, but less each day. "You were such a serious little boy. Only music could make you smile after your parents." She paused, touching the locket she always wore with their picture. "They would be so proud of you, mi amor." The door chime interrupted them. It was Mr. Cooper with more exciting news. The morning shows are fighting over who gets to do your first live TV performance, he announced. And wait until you hear this. Lorenzo's has been booked solid for months. Everyone wants to eat where Tommy Martinez got his start, Rose laughed. Poor Mr. Lorenzo. He always said he wanted his restaurant to be famous for the food, not the entertainment. Are you kidding? Maria chimed in from the doorway. He's loving every minute of it. He tells everyone who comes in about how he discovered you both, though his version gets more dramatic each time. They were interrupted by another video call from James Morrison. His excited face filled the screen. Drop everything, he announced. I've just finished the arrangement for your first single. It's a new song written specially for you both. It's called Second Chances. As they listened to the demo, Tommy felt tears in his eyes. The lyrics told their story perfectly. About love that never gives up, about dreams that wait patiently, about the healing power of music. Rose squeezed his hand, her own eyes shining. It's perfect, she whispered. That evening, as the sun set, their little house was full of people again. Mr. Lorenzo brought dinner from the restaurant. Mrs. Peterson baked her famous cookies. Maria organized the next day's schedule while fielding calls from reporters. Miguel came by with Tommy's homework and stayed to listen to the new song. In the midst of all the activity, Tommy noticed Rose watching everyone with a peaceful smile. She looked better than she had in months. Her cheeks had color, her eyes were bright, and her breathing was steady and strong. Happy, Abuela? He asked, sitting beside her. More than happy, she replied. I'm blessed. You know, when I gave up my singing career to raise you, some people said I was making a mistake. But looking at you now, seeing the wonderful young man you've become, I know it was the best decision I ever made. Tommy leaned his head on her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with fresh flowers from the garden. And now we get to share music together. Yes, mi amor. God gives us gifts, but sometimes we have to wait for the right moment to unwrap them. Outside, a group of neighborhood children had gathered on the sidewalk, as they did most evenings now, hoping to hear Tommy and Rose practice. Through the open windows, their voices carried into the warm night air, grandmother and grandson singing in perfect harmony, their song of love and second chances touching hearts far beyond their little house on Maple Street. The day of their first television appearance arrived bright and clear. Good Morning America had won the battle to host Tommy and Rose's debut performance, flying them to New York City in a private plane provided by James Morrison's production company. I can't believe we're really here, Tommy said, looking out the hotel window at Times Square below. Their faces smiled back at him from one of the giant billboards. America's Musical Family, the story that touched millions. Rose sat in a comfortable chair while a makeup artist worked on her face. She looked elegant in a new black dress with silver trim inspired by her old performance costume, but designed specially for this appearance. Just remember what James said, she told Tommy. Sing like we're at home in your bedroom. Forget about the cameras. The morning show's green room was full of activity. Maria fussed with Tommy's collar while Mr. Cooper reviewed the interview questions with them one last time. James Morrison had flown in to support them and was telling funny stories about his early days at Lorenzo's to help calm their nerves. Mrs. Martinez, a young production assistant, appeared at the door. There's someone here who says she knows you. A Sandra Williams? Rose's face lit up. Sandy, from the old singing days. An elegant older woman rushed in, tears already flowing. Rose Martinez, when I saw you on the news, I couldn't believe it. After all these years, the two women hugged while Tommy watched curiously. He had never seen this side of his grandmother's past life. Sandy and I used to perform together, Rose explained. Before... She didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what had changed her path. And now look at you, Sandy said, turning to Tommy. Following in your grandmother's footsteps. When I heard your story, how you sang to save her. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Well, let's just say I'm not the only one from the old days who's been following your journey. More visitors arrived, other singers from Rose's past, who had seen the news and come to support her. The green room filled with laughter and old stories. Tommy learned more about his grandmother's singing career in those few hours than he had in his whole life. 5 minutes to air, called the producer. The butterflies in Tommy's stomach turned into hawks. but then he felt Rose's hand slip into his, steady and warm. "Together, mi amor," she whispered, "just like at home." The lights were bright on the Good Morning America set. The hosts were friendly, asking about their story, about the surgery, about their upcoming album. Tommy let Rose do most of the talking, amazed at how natural she seemed in front of the cameras. Then it was time. The lights dimmed, and the opening notes of Second Chances began to play. Tommy looked at Rose, saw her take a deep breath, and then they began to sing. Their voices blended perfectly, just as they had in Tommy's bedroom. Rose's rich alto complemented his clear young tenor, telling their story of love and faith and music. As they sang, images played on the screens behind them. Tommy performing at Lorenzo's, Rose in the hospital, their emotional reunion, the community coming together to support them. In the final verse, Rose's voice grew stronger, reaching up to harmonize above Tommy's melody. The studio audience was silent, many wiping tears from their eyes. Even the camera operators were crying. As the last note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the applause began, building into a standing ovation. The show's hosts were dabbing at their eyes, trying to maintain their professional composure. "That was There Are No Words," one host managed to say. "Ladies and gentlemen, Tommy and Rose Martinez." Backstage afterward, the green room was chaos. Phone calls and messages poured in. The song was already trending on social media. Record. Stores were calling about pre-orders for the album. But Tommy and Rose sat quietly together in a corner, holding hands, watching the excitement swirl around them. "Think of all the doors this will open for you," Sandy said to Tommy. "You could be the next big star." But Tommy shook his head. "We're a package deal," he said, squeezing Rose's hand. "Everything we do together." James Morrison appeared with more news. "The video's gone viral again. Over 2 million views in just an hour. And wait until you hear this. Children's hospitals around the country want you to come sing for their patients." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "Really? Your story gives people hope," James said simply. "And that's what the world needs right now." Later that night, back in their hotel room, Tommy and Rose stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Their reflection in the glass showed two people who looked more alike than ever, despite the years between them. The same gentle eyes, the same warm smile, the same love of music shining from within. "I never thought I'd perform again," Rose said softly. "When I gave up singing to raise you, I thought that part of my life was over forever. But it was just waiting," Tommy replied. "Like you always say, God's timing is perfect." Rose touched her chest where the new heart valve kept steady time. "Yes, His timing is perfect. And now we have something even more special than what I had before. We have each other." Below their window, fans had gathered, holding signs and singing Second Chances. The mother and son who ran the corner store were there. So were several nurses from Memorial Hospital. Even Mr. Lorenzo had flown up to New York to support them. "Look, Abuela," Tommy said. "Our family keeps growing." Rose smiled, remembering the lonely days after losing her daughter and son-in-law, when only Tommy's presence had kept her going. Now their little family of two had expanded to include so many people who loved and supported them. "Sing with me?" she asked softly. And there in their hotel room, high above the lights of Times Square, grandmother and grandson sang their special song once more. Their voices carried down to the street below, where the crowd fell silent to listen, feeling the magic that had touched so many hearts. Inside the hotel, a cleaning lady paused in her work, remembering her own grandmother back home. In the lobby, a businessman stopped checking his phone, thinking of the music lessons he'd given up long ago. And somewhere in heaven, Tommy's parents smiled down on their son and his grandmother, as the gift of music they'd passed down continued to change lives in ways they never could have imagined. 1 year later, Lorenzo's restaurant was packed to capacity. Every table was filled and people stood wherever they could find space. The occasion? The first anniversary of Tommy's debut performance and the release party for Tommy and Rose's album, Stars in Our Hearts. The small stage where it had all begun was decorated with white roses and silver ribbons. Pictures lined the walls. Tommy's first performance, Rose in her hospital bed, their Good Morning America appearance, and dozens of moments from their incredible journey. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Maria asked, straightening Tommy's tie. At 14 now, he had grown taller, but his eyes still held the same gentle kindness. Rose sat at her special table, looking radiant in a blue evening gown. Her oxygen tube was gone. She hadn't needed it for months. The surgery, combined with the joy of singing again, had given her a new lease on life. "Remember how scared you were that first night?" Mr. Lorenzo asked Tommy, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now look at you, performed at the White House last month." The past year had been like a dream. Their album had topped the charts, not just because of their story, but because of the genuine love and emotion in their music. They had performed at hospitals across the country, bringing hope to sick children and their families. Rose had even started a foundation to help families with medical bills, turning their struggle into a way to help others. "Places, everyone," James Morrison called out. He had become like family over the past year, guiding their career with the same gentle care he'd received from Rose so long ago. The room fell silent as Tommy took the stage. At 14, his voice had begun to change, but that had only added richness to his tone. He looked out at the familiar faces, Mrs. Peterson wiping her eyes already, Miguel giving him a thumbs up, his teachers beaming with pride. "A year ago," Tommy began, "I stood on this stage, scared and desperate, trying to save my grandmother. I didn't know then that I was actually starting a journey that would change both our lives forever." He reached out his hand and Rose joined him on stage. They had done this hundreds of times now, but performing at Lorenzo's always felt special. "Tonight, we want to share something new with you," Rose said. "A song Tommy wrote for me, about the power of love and music to heal not just hearts but souls." The new song began softly, with Tommy singing about a boy's love for his grandmother. Then Rose joined in, her voice strong and clear, singing about dreams reborn and love that never dies. Their voices wove together, telling their story in a way that touched every heart in the room. As they sang, a slideshow played behind them. There they were at children's hospitals, singing with young patients. Rose teaching a music class at the community center. Tommy performing at school functions, the two of them on talk shows, always together, always sharing their message of hope. The last picture was the most special, Tommy and Rose in the recording studio, heads close together, working on their music. Behind them on the wall hung a photo of Tommy's parents, watching over them with proud smiles. When the song ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Mr. Lorenzo was sobbing openly into his handkerchief. Maria and Mrs. Peterson held each other, crying and laughing at the same time. "We have an announcement to make," Rose said, holding Tommy's hand tightly. "Thanks to the success of our album and the generosity of so many people, the Rose Martinez Foundation has raised enough money to help 50 families pay for life-saving surgeries this year." The applause was deafening. Someone started chanting, "Tommy and Rose, Tommy and Rose," until the whole restaurant joined in. Later that night, after the party was over and the last guests had gone home, Tommy and Rose sat at their special table. The restaurant was quiet now, but the energy of the evening still lingered in the air. "Penny for your thoughts, mi amor," Rose asked. Tommy looked at his grandmother, his partner, his inspiration, his best friend. "I was just thinking about that. First night, when I was so scared about losing you, I never imagined we'd end up here. God works in mysterious ways," Rose said, touching the silver locket that held his parents' picture. "Sometimes the hardest moments in our lives lead us to the greatest blessings." Mr. Lorenzo brought them each a slice of his famous tiramisu, on the house as always. "You two changed this place," he said. "Changed all of us, really." Through the window, they could see the line of people already forming for tomorrow night's performance. Every week, new faces joined their extended family of fans and friends. But here in Lorenzo's, they would always be just Tommy and Rose, the boy who sang to save his grandmother, and the woman who gave up her dreams only to find them reborn through her grandson's love. "Ready to go home?" Tommy asked, offering Rose his arm. "In a minute," she said. "First, sing with me? Just one more time?" And so, in the quiet of the empty restaurant where their journey began, Tommy and Rose sang "Stars in the Night" one more time. Their voices filled the familiar space with love and gratitude, a reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles come not in the form we expect, but in the perfect way we need. Outside, the stars twinkled in the night sky, just like in their song. Inside Lorenzo's, a grandmother and grandson held hands across a table, their hearts beating strong and steady, their voices rising together in perfect harmony. Their story had touched millions, but in the end, it was still just about love. The kind of love that heals hearts, rebuilds dreams, and reminds us all that it's never too late for a second chance. As they walked home that night, people on their street called out greetings. Children ran up for hugs. Neighbors waved from their porches. Tommy and Rose walked slowly, enjoying the moment, knowing that tomorrow would bring new adventures, new songs, and new chances to share their gift with the world. But for now, they were just Tommy and Rose Martinez, walking hand in hand down Maple Street, their hearts full of music and love, their story a testament to the power of faith, family, and the healing magic of a song sung straight from the heart.